There are moments in history when civilizations stand at the very edge of darkness, when empires that once ruled continents crumble not with a roar, but with a whisper. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of a city, nor the fall of a dynasty. It was the twilight of Rome itself, the last flicker of an ancient flame that had burned for nearly 2,000 years. But behind this tragedy lies a story far stranger and more mysterious than the chronicles of war, a story of faith, prophecy, and perhaps an emperor's secret voyage beyond the known world. By the 15th century, the Roman Empire was a mere shadow of its former glory. The Palaiologos dynasty, rulers since 1261, struggled to hold together the last fragments of Byzantium. Their treasury was empty, their armies scattered, and their empire reduced to little more than the walls of Constantinople itself. Endless wars and bitter theological disputes had drained both their strength and their spirit. In 1425, Emperor John VIII Palaiologos ascended the throne. With the empire surrounded by enemies, he sought salvation not through the sword, but through diplomacy. His hope lay in reconciling the centuries-old divide between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches. At the Council of Florence in 1437, he accepted Catholic doctrines, the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, the filioque, and the Pope's supreme authority, in exchange for a promise of Latin aid against the Ottoman threat. But when John returned home, he was met not with celebration, but fury. The people saw his decision as a betrayal of the Orthodox faith. And when the promised Western Crusade ended in disaster at Varna in 1444, the emperor's dream collapsed. The Crusaders were annihilated, and with them, the last hope of saving Byzantium. John died in 1448, leaving the throne to his brother, Constantine XI Palaiologos, a courageous man and a loyal supporter of Florence. Yet by then, the empire was little more than a dying ember. Constantinople's population had dwindled to around 50,000. The once mighty navy of Rome had been reduced to a handful of decaying galleys. Meanwhile, across the straits, a young and ambitious ruler had risen, Mehmed II. In 1451, he took the Ottoman throne, determined to achieve what no sultan before him could, the conquest of Constantinople. 2 years later, he assembled an army of 80,000 men, equipped with massive cannons capable of shattering the city's legendary walls. On May 29, 1453, after nearly 2,000 years of history, Constantinople fell. The final emperor died fighting among his soldiers, and with his death, the Eastern Roman Empire ceased to exist. But there is a legend, a lesser-known tale buried in forgotten manuscripts that suggests the Romans may have sought something beyond mere survival. It begins 3 decades earlier, during John VIII's journey to Italy. In 1423, seeking aid against the Ottoman advance, the emperor traveled to Florence, where he met the wealthy and influential Medici family. The Medici not only offered him hospitality, but opened their vast libraries to him, collections of ancient wisdom gathered from across the Mediterranean world. There, John encountered texts that hinted at mysterious lands beyond the Western Ocean. Plato had spoken of Atlantis, a realm greater than Africa and Asia combined. Plutarch mentioned Ogygia, a land far to the west of Britain. Pliny the Elder wrote of Hanno the Carthaginian, who discovered a paradise so perfect that his senate forbade others from going there, fearing mass desertion. Even the Roman philosopher Seneca had written a prophecy. There shall come an age in later years when the ocean shall unloose the bonds of things, and the whole broad earth shall be revealed. Christian writings, too, seemed to support the idea. Pope Clement of Rome and Saint Isidore of Seville Both referred to lands beyond the ocean. One evening, while praying beneath the unfinished dome of the Florence Cathedral, John asked the Virgin Mary for a sign. Later that same day, he came across the story of Saint Brendan the Navigator, an Irish monk who, guided by divine visions, sailed west in search of the promised land of the saints. According to legend, Saint Brendan found it, a vast and radiant realm overflowing with light and light. A native youth told him, "After many ages, this land shall be known to your descendants. When the persecution of Christians comes, this place shall be a refuge of light, for its light is Christ." To a desperate emperor, those words were not mere myth, they were prophecy. John saw in them a divine message. The Byzantine people, weary and broken from centuries of war, would find redemption not in Europe or Asia, but across the sea. Upon returning to Constantinople, John shared his vision with a trusted circle of nobles and scholars. In secret, he commissioned a small fleet of Portuguese caravels, manned by loyal Greeks and Italians who swore sacred oaths upon relics from the Hagia Sophia. Their mission was bold, to sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the uncharted Atlantic. The voyage was long and perilous. Storms battered their ships, food supplies ran low, and superstition grew among the crew. Yet after weeks of hardship, they sighted land, a lush coast filled with strange vegetation and unfamiliar people. The explorers traded cautiously with the natives, charted parts of the shoreline, and after gathering what knowledge they could, returned to Constantinople. To John, this was no coincidence. It was confirmation. His prayers had been answered. The Queen of Heaven had shown him a new world, a refuge for Christendom beyond the reach of the infidel. Empowered by this revelation, he renewed his commitment to the Union of Florence, purging anti-Latin clerics and strengthening his ties with the Catholic West in the hope of securing divine favor and earthly support. It was, perhaps, a final attempt to preserve not just the empire, but the spirit of Rome itself. And though Constantinople would soon fall, the idea of a land beyond the ocean, a promised world where faith and civilization might begin anew, would endure. A myth, perhaps, or a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. In the twilight years of Byzantium, Emperor John acted in secrecy, driven by desperation and the weight of a crumbling empire. Behind the marble walls of his palace, he orchestrated deals that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. He sold imperial assets piece by piece, trading noble titles, commercial rights, and territorial claims to Venetian, Genoese, and Aragonese merchants in exchange for gold. His treasury, once filled with the wealth of centuries, had become a hollow echo of its former grandeur. Yet his vision reached far beyond the decaying walls of Constantinople. Engineers, architects, and scholars were ordered to copy every blueprint of the empire's greatest monuments: the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Apostles, the Blacherne Palace, the Theodosian Walls, and even the ancient Hippodrome. Every trace of the empire's soul, laws, manuscripts, icons, jeweled relics, altars, and sacred crosses was catalogued and packed away. The emperor intended not to surrender Byzantium, but to carry it with him across the sea. As resources dwindled, John poured what little remained into the construction of a fleet unlike any the empire had seen. Latin craftsmen were commissioned to build sturdy galleons and caravels, ships designed for the open Atlantic rather than the gentle Aegean. The costs were astronomical, draining the treasury to its depths. When the Varna Crusade fell to ruin in 1444 and the Turks swept across the Balkans, John's final hope for defending the empire died. It was then he made his most controversial decision: to sell Constantinople itself to the Venetians. The city, the very heart of the Roman legacy, was traded for supplies, grain, livestock, iron, and timber. To his people, it was an unthinkable betrayal. To John, it was survival. By 1448, the fleet was complete, over 400 vessels, making it the largest armada in Roman history. The emperor proclaimed it an ark for a chosen people. But his vision was not shared by all. Many Romans, still bitter over his acceptance of the Council of Florence and its union with the Latin Church, refused to follow him. Only 70,000 joined the exodus: Greeks, Albanians, and other Balkan peoples, many already displaced or enslaved by the Ottomans. To them, this voyage was both an escape and a rebirth. In the spring of that year, the Golden Horn was alive with movement. Hundreds of ships, loaded with the empire's people, treasures, and sacred relics, swayed gently beneath the rising sun. Officially, their mission was to aid Castile in settling the Canary Islands. Unofficially, they were fleeing forever. When the fleet passed beyond the Pillars of Heracles into the vast Atlantic, Europe lost sight of them forever. They never reached the Canaries. Whispers spread like wildfire across the continent. Some said the fleet was swallowed by a tempest. Others believed they had found Antilia, the legendary Western Isle where Visigothic bishops had once fled from Muslim conquest. Chroniclers and sailors spoke of ghostly ships vanishing into mist, of strange lights over the ocean. No one knew the truth. Emperor John had dedicated the journey to Saint Nicholas, protector of sailors, and to the Virgin Theotokos, seeking divine guidance. But as the fleet pressed into the unknown, his health faltered. He grew weaker with every passing day. The voyage was perilous. Tempests struck, waves rose like mountains, yet no ship was lost. Chroniclers would later write that the Lord went before them as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, guiding their course as he had guided Moses and Noah before. For 5 long weeks, they sailed across endless waters. Then, one morning, a lookout cried out from the mast, "Land!" Before them stretched a green and radiant shore, fringed with palm trees and forests bursting with life. Strange birds filled the sky, and rivers gleamed like silver threads weaving through the wilderness. The exhausted voyagers wept with joy. But their triumph came at a terrible cost. Emperor John, the architect of their salvation, had died only days before landfall. Like Moses, he had seen the promised land, but never set foot upon it. His brother Constantine ascended the throne, swearing to carry out his brother's vision. The fleet anchored near a lush island they named Brandanos, believing it to be the radiant land from the ancient tales of Saint Brendan the Navigator. But soon it became clear they had reached an entirely new world, a vast continent untouched by European civilization. They named it Macaria, the Blessed Place. Brandanos was rich in natural resources, dense forests ideal for shipbuilding, fertile soil for farming, and rivers teeming with fish. They planted their European crops, wheat, olives, grapes, and adopted native staples like corn and sweet potatoes. Their livestock flourished in the abundant grasslands, and soon their settlement began to take shape. On the southern coast, beside a sheltered bay they called the Sea of St. Nicholas, the Romans found a limestone quarry and a wide freshwater river. It was the perfect site for a new beginning. There they built their capital, Place Helen, the city of St. Helena, named after Constantine the Great's mother. Over time, it became known simply as Helenon. The city rose from the earth as a mirror of Constantinople, its streets laid in familiar patterns, its churches crowned with domes, its walls adorned with mosaics depicting their exodus. Hellenon was declared the mother city of Constantinople, a spiritual successor that kept the torch of Rome alive. The Patriarch of Constantinople retained his title, much as the popes in Avignon had continued to call themselves bishops of Rome. The settlers, loyal to the emperor and the Latin Church, upheld their Catholic faith, convinced that one day their Western brethren would find them and rejoice in reunion. Yet fear kept them isolated. They forbade any to return to Europe, terrified that doing so would reveal their refuge to the Ottomans. Cut off from the old world, they grew in peace and secrecy. Over generations, the Romans of Macaria built a thriving society. Their architecture blended Byzantine grace with the raw beauty of their new land. Their scholars preserved Greek texts, their priests kept the ancient rites, and their sailors mapped the unknown coasts of their continent. In their isolation, they believed themselves chosen by God, an unbroken continuation of Rome, hidden beyond the Western Sea. In their hearts, the dream of returning to Constantinople never faded. But as centuries passed, their new empire flourished on its own, a silent Byzantium reborn beneath unfamiliar stars. Hellenon rose from the shores of the New World with breathtaking speed. Its streets were laid in perfect Roman precision, a grid of order and ambition carved into an untamed island. Timber-framed buildings stood proudly with walls of limestone and roofs of clay-fired tiles that shimmered beneath the sun. The harbor was alive with movement, shipwrights hammering oak and cedar planks, forging a fleet ready to venture beyond the horizon. The air smelled of sawdust, salt, and dreams of exploration. Across the growing city, artisans toiled in devotion, building churches whose domes gleamed with mosaics and icons recalling the glory of the old empire. They recreated the spirit of Constantinople itself, a new Rome born from exile. But beneath the beauty and the order, the Byzantines remained who they had always been, cautious, tempered by centuries of siege and survival. 1,000 years of defending their capital had forged a people wary of the unknown. Now, transplanted into a new world, they struggled to shift from survival to expansion. Within the imperial court, one mystery lingered, haunting the minds of even the most learned scholars. When Emperor John first heard of these distant lands decades earlier, reports spoke of vast nations of native peoples. Yet now, there were almost none. A few scattered tribes remained, weak and sickly, but the thriving civilizations described by early sailors had vanished. The Byzantines puzzled over this. Unable to fathom that their first contact, a quarter century before, had unleashed an invisible plague, waves of European diseases that swept across the Caribbean, decimating nearly 90% of the indigenous population. Entire societies were erased before they even met their conquerors. Those who survived in parts of Bernardinos were swiftly subdued, their lives reshaped under Byzantine law, language, and faith. They were baptized, taught Greek and Latin, and absorbed into this reborn Roman world. Yet the Byzantines' venture differed from the European conquests that history would one day remember. They had not come chasing gold or riches. Their vision was of permanence, not plunder. They had prepared for a self-sufficient society, one that could sustain itself without the lifeline of a distant homeland. By the late 1490s, nearly 50 years after their first arrival, the colony flourished. Across the Sea of St. Nicholas, their towns expanded. Their farms yielded harvests of olives, grapes, and wheat adapted to the island's soil. More than 200,000 souls now lived under the Macarian sun, generations born who knew of Constantinople only through stories whispered at twilight. The empire had been reborn not through conquest alone, but through endurance and adaptation. Still, the land tested them. The subtropical air was thicker, the sun more merciless than the soft Mediterranean light they once knew. Rain came in torrents, and the humidity clung to skin like armor. Fevers stalked the settlements, strange diseases that had no name in the old world, taking many lives. Yet the Byzantines endured. Their superior iron tools, horses, and organized armies ensured their dominance. They pushed outward, conquering the neighboring volcanic islands whose blackened soils brimmed with sulfur, vital for making gunpowder. In the caves near Helenon, they discovered nitrate crystals glittering like salt. There, beside the harbor, they built the empire's first industrial quarter, smokestacks rising as workers refined crude gunpowder. It was enough to arm their fleets and secure the trade routes across Macaria's glittering blue waters. Then, one morning in the year 1492, the peace of their isolation shattered. The cathedral bells of St. Helena tolled as 3 ships appeared through the mist, their sails bearing the red and gold of Castile. The sailors who stepped ashore were ragged from their voyage, their leader a man named Christopher Columbus. He had crossed the ocean seeking Asia, and instead found a city that should not have existed. Before him stood stone walls, olive groves, and churches crowned with golden domes. Armored horsemen rode through streets that spoke Latin, not any language of the Indies he expected. The shock was mutual. For the Byzantines, these Europeans were like messengers from a forgotten world. They received Columbus with caution, but also with dignity, welcoming him to the palace beneath frescoed ceilings that told the story of their flight from Constantinople. When Columbus revealed who he was and where he had come from, the court fell silent. He spoke of Europe, of how Constantinople had fallen to the Turks, how the patriarch of the new Ottoman city had turned the Eastern faith against the West, and how the once united Christendom had fractured. The emperor and his council listened with sorrow and disbelief. They had endured decades believing their homeland still free, still shining. Now, they realized that the Rome they had fled no longer existed. And yet, as Columbus listened to their story, he too realized the enormity of what stood before him. This was no lost outpost, no forgotten colony. It was a living empire, a continuation of Rome reborn across the sea. Columbus, representing Castile, proposed trade and alliance. The Basileus agreed, seeing in this meeting the bridge between the old world and the new. Supplies were exchanged, gifts offered, and treaties written. As the Castilian ships departed eastward once more, carrying news of this astonishing civilization, the bells of Helenon rang again, announcing not an ending, but a beginning. Europe's gaze, long fixed on the east, now turned westward. Thus began a new chapter in the chronicles of mankind, a tale where the Roman flame never died, but crossed the ocean to burn anew. And as history's tide shifted once more, the world stood on the brink of an age no one had ever imagined. For those who wonder what could have been, imagine another world, one where the Byzantines triumphed centuries earlier, defeating the Arab armies in the 7th century and preserving the empire's strength. If you've enjoyed exploring this alternate history, consider subscribing for more stories of lost empires, untold victories, and what-if worlds that might have been. Each tale you hear is made possible by the generous support of those who keep history's imagination alive.